Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another Bible study here at the Tree.Church. Today, I'm going to be joined by Pastors Brandon and Michael, and we're going to be looking at the end of chapter 16 of Deuteronomy and all of chapter 17. We're going to be looking at really what the part that faith plays in our relationship with God. And what I love so much about these Bible studies is we're not just simply looking at information, because the Bible was never meant to be information. It was meant to apply to our life, to be life-changing. So we're going to look at not only what is said, what's been taught, we're going to look at how it applies to our life. And so we pray that this is a blessing to you.
If you are new to being a disciple, or you would like to grow in your understanding of the practices that are vital to connecting with God on a regular basis, the Tree.Church classes is releasing an updated version of Intro to Christian Habits. This is a 6-session masterclass that you can access on the Tree.Church website and app. This course will guide you through habits such as prayer, worship, Bible study, gathering together, and generosity, and why they are so important to establish in our lives. This class is free and available for you to start anytime after May 15th, 2022.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to another Tree.Church Bible study. I'm Matthew Johnson, lead pastor here at the Tree.Church, and today I'm joined by two of our pastors. One is Pastor Brandon, who's over our discipleship.
Hello, everyone.
And Pastor Michael, who handles all things creative at our church.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So today, in our Bible study, what we're going to do is we're going to conclude what we began to look at last week in chapter 16. So we have a couple of sections we're going to look at as we transition to cover all of chapter 17 of Deuteronomy. So chapter 16 are 3 different festivals that Moses is commanding the people of Israel to celebrate on an annual basis. Each one of these had a really practical side to it, also had a spiritual side to it. Practical in that they had to make sacrifices, they had to go back to Jerusalem, and everything represented something greater than what they were actually doing. So I'm not going to go into all that detail because you can easily connect with the previous Bible study about that. But as Moses is talking about this concept, what each of these festivals, as of all of obedience in Deuteronomy, it requires faith. The root of everything that God commands us requires faith, that we can trust in his ways, and when he asks us to do things that don't make sense, we still just trust him. We know in the goodness of God, and so everything he commands us to do in faith, we can believe and walk in obedience. Today is going to be no different. So whereas in chapter 16, he's covering festivals, which in that sense, I think all of them are good things, would actually even be fun for the community because there's some celebrations. Today, we're going to look at some heavy things, some things that I'll just tell you, we're talking about capital punishment today, which is a very serious topic. It also is going to require faith. So what we'll see is on the positive things of life still require faith. The negative require faith, everything in between. And so I'm just going to jump right into where we left off last week. In chapter 16, picking up in verses 18 through 20, it says, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert justice, you shall not show partiality, you shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous." I love this next verse, how it's worded. "Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land the Lord your God is giving you." So it's important to recognize in these laws what God is doing. This is a group of people who have been slaves initially for 400 years, so generational slavery, which meant everything that they did was under the authority and laws of a different culture. They've been set free at this point. They've wandered for 40 years, but they really haven't been a community. They've been a community in the sense of they've been transitioning through the wilderness, but they haven't set up communities. They haven't set up structures. So when God gives them the law, many times theologians break it into 3 categories. He gave them the moral law, like we would say the 10 Commandments are those, and some other things that are always right and wrong. He gave them ceremonial law, the different things to do with sacrifices. But then he'll have laws like this, which are more the civic laws of how to set up a community. And the first thing he highlights is you have to focus on justice. You have to appoint judges. Judges would have been people that would have literally, very similar to our culture now, people would have brought disputes in front of them. They would have heard both sides and make a judgment, make a decision for them. And so when we look at this, justice is at the center of God's heart.
Right.
It is who he is. God is just. It's not just something he does, but God celebrates justice. He blesses it, but he also will resist and condemn injustice.
Right.
So, Michael, I want to go to you first. I know this genuinely. You have a heart that really does value justice. It's something that you talk about a lot. I've seen through social media and through discussions with you. It's something that you champion. You've taught on it, actually, on Sundays when you've had the opportunity to teach. Can you just talk about that? Why is this topic so near and dear to your heart?
Sure, man. Well, first of all, I love the way you said that justice is at the center of God's heart. And for more than anything else, if justice is at the center of God's heart, saying no to justice is saying no to God. It's saying no to not only God, but who he is and then the image of him in us. We're saying no to the very design of how he intentionally made us. And that's something that I think we should take super seriously. And then that's like just the more we're designed that way, so I want to operate that way. Past that, I was really blessed. I actually got to spend some time there this weekend. I went to go see my grandma, my mom's mom. Went to her house for the weekend. It was awesome. I got to hang out. And she is someone who lived in a time who experienced very dramatically what injustice looks like. Jim Crow's still around. White people and black people can't drink from the same water fountain. And she instilled in me very young that is unacceptable. That she said people are going to try to pretend like this wasn't a big deal. People are going to try to brush this under the rug. The reality is it was horrifying, and I want you to know that. I remember her taking me to like an operational farm as a kid. I was pretty young, and they basically walked you through what the Underground Railroad would have looked like, and trying to get from this place to this place, and trying to show you those moments of fear and how it would have impacted somebody. She did the same thing talking about World War II and the Holocaust. To this day, on her mantle, which is like this is the peak point of her home, over her mantelpiece is a picture of Israel with God's hands around it, just because she's so passionate about marginalized people. She's just like, those are God's people, so I take it seriously. Whether it be race, whether it be nationality, anybody who is oppressed, he just at such a young age made it clear of like, this is unacceptable. And if you're going to love Jesus, you're going to love those people. You can't separate the two.
And isn't that true that injustice makes you long for justice more than anything else?
Absolutely.
You will never appreciate justice more than when you've been a victim of injustice. Like I know from the simple things, when you're a kid and your sibling does something unfair, that's probably like 95% of what I solve with my kids is the injustice of their life.
Yeah.
But when as you're an adult and you start to experience it, it can feel helpless. You feel powerless, and you desire it, you crave for it. What's fascinating about God is his heart for those who have been marginalized, those who, and that's what this command's about, is set up a system that can protect all people. Don't set up a system that's just for the powerful. And in this, he tells them, for you that have been given that position, that comes with an extra responsibility. You're the one that's not to take a bribe, not to show partiality. Brandon, as for you and your role as a leader, what does that mean to you, that calling? And even to go a little bit deeper, what are the systems that you set up as a pastor, as a leader, to make sure that you remain healthy as a leader? Because this is what he's saying. Put a system in place so that the system is good for the community, but you as a leader are protecting yourself so that you don't become this way.
Yeah, the biggest thing I think for me is recognizing what exactly even God or Moses is communicating in this moment. And the concept is that God is that standard for determining justice in our lives.
Absolutely.
And I think, even just a side note, anytime that I've tried to use my own judgment or my own justice to kind of justify something or to look at a situation, I'm always missing maybe some of the influence of what God is trying to do in that moment. So I always have to view justice through the lens of, what does God want? So I'm going to seek that first above anything else. And even you were talking about growing up, my wife is a school teacher, and she experiences a lot of just the situations of kids' lives and the things that they're dealing with. And a lot of even maybe some of the injustices that they experienced in their home lives. And so all of us, in our situation and having those conversations about how do we approach situations like this, it's always, man, God has to be at the forefront of how we handle our jobs, our home life, everything, and making sure that we're instilling those in my ministry, but also in my home life as well. So.
Yeah, last night I went out with my son Titus. We went out to dinner, and then I caught a movie. And Titus has a real inquisitive mind, and he likes to ask me questions about the Bible and about leadership. And at times, he's wrestling with things I wish that my kid didn't have to. He's 14,
Sure,
and And he's like my height, so at times he can seem older. But I wish, like, just as a father, I want to protect him. But one of the questions he asked me, which was really sobering, is he said, "Dad, why does it seem like so many pastors are failing morally?" And he connected a little bit to like certain podcasts that were exposing churches. I don't necessarily love those podcasts if I'm honest. But he was just asking that question, and so we had a really good conversation about at times leaders don't put protections around themselves, and they get a position of authority without any accountability. And then what happens is they start to believe the hype. They start to believe that in their own abilities, basically they're above the law. Right. And then they become extremely dangerous as leaders. Michael, why don't you speak to, again, kind of similar question I gave Brandon, in your own life, but also what you recognize within our culture. What are the things that we put in place so that we're not that way, where we haven't become desensitized and where we're, explaining away really sinful behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. It really starts with you and what you've taught me when I first started working here. This idea, I don't know that I've ever heard you phrase it this way, but this is how I've always interpreted it. Be the first person in the room to change your mind, to say I was wrong, to say, oh, wait, that's totally better. Let's do that now. There's such a deep level of humility about the way we approach ideas and concepts and thoughts, and whether it be a cool creative element for Easter Sunday, that's more in our space. We're going to talk about a discipleship event. There's such an open-handedness because there's a lot of humility there. And if you don't have that humility, that's where it's immediately, when I talk to a leader, there's this massive red flag, specifically a church leader. It's like, it may have been 10 years since you said I was wrong. It may have been a long time before you actually heard someone else's idea and said, oh, that's actually better. So for me, I've been at the Tree for like 7 years now, coming up on 7 years. And I just remember that flooring me so much of like, wow, Matt says he's wrong a lot. And that's like, because it was so foreign to me, because prior places that I've worked, and not even just in church world, just human beings in general, we have this impulse to hold on to I'm right. Like I found myself in that spot where I know I'm wrong and I'm still arguing. It's like, okay, this is dumb. When you see people like that, and it always leads to these massive red flags of like, what else is happening in your life that you have no humility in, that there's no accountability, that there's no potential for justice because you're so holding on to like whatever. It could be your image, it could be your ego, it could be 1,000 things. But all I know is without that humility, it's dangerous. And something we see in our staff is it's just unacceptable.
I think that is the most critical point that you made is the necessity for humility, because I agree with you. If you can't think of a time, I would even say recently, where you realized you were wrong, then there's a good chance you're super arrogant, right? And then if you're arrogant, you're treating people arrogantly, which means you're hurting people, right? And you're missing even like the heart of what he's saying here of the concept of justice. I know for me, like in my own marriage, in my arrogance, I used to argue with Mary because I valued the process of debate, not realizing that I was being like, there was injustice in our marriage because I wasn't listening to her heart. I wasn't connecting to her. And I remember the moment, I've shared this from the front before, but I remember the point. So this is the truth. My wife has never yelled at me, like that's her nature. That's a testament to her, not me. Like I've never done anything to be yelled at. But she just looked at me one time, and this is the harshest. Excuse me. I just get so choked up. No, I'm sorry. I just swallowed wrong on there. But no, she just looked at me and said, you can be such a jerk sometimes. And she said it calm, which is almost worse, right? Like if someone screams it at you, you're like, okay, we're doing this, right? Yeah. But she's never been mean, and she said, but I just realized, and I remember, like, I went to prayer after that, and I was like, God, help me, whatever I'm missing, convict me. And I realized I was not creating a culture where I was honoring her. I wasn't creating a culture to protect her, and so there was injustice. And I think this is what we have to recognize. We have to look around and say, okay, have I created a culture that is safe? Have I created a culture where people can grow and people can be blessed? So, all right. That's the first two verses. I think we always start our Bible studies this way where, we talk for a while. Okay, so now he transitions. So still with the heart of faith, he's going to transition to talking about acceptable worship. So now we're in the last just couple verses of chapter 16, verse 21. He says, you shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord your God that you shall make. And you shall not set up a pillar which the Lord your God hates. There's some mystery around this. I don't know if you guys in your research saw the same thing. And I remember years ago even studying the concept of Asherah or Ashram, the statues and stuff, because I would see it all the time in Scripture, and there's some debate. Here's what basically I found was it obviously represented a Canaanite god, and many believe a goddess, the goddess of fertility or reproduction. And so what God is saying here is basically based on the same concept of the Ten Commandments. He's not going to compete. He's not looking to be one of your gods, one of your sources of hope. He wants to be your sole God, your sole source of hope. And so what he's saying to them is that the type of worship that he will accept is the worship where he's number one. Right? Mm-hmm. Anyone want to argue with that?
No. And I think that's such a common theme throughout this entire book. It's just the amount of times it's just layers and layers and layers of don't worship idols. Please. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just Moses, like, please just don't do it. You know what I mean? Because it's important, and because they're also talking about somebody who saw the negative consequences of when this is not followed. Mm-hmm. And so that's where there's such a harsh like emphasis of like, man, we're not gonna play with this.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that word beside is in there, because I know we might go on to talk about this a little bit, but the idea that they can be one and the same or beside each other, that they are competing with one another, maybe potentially at times, and that's such an important word that kind of stands out to me as I'm processing through it.
For sure, and we've acknowledged this a couple of times. In their culture, they had physical representations of their hope, in essence. Mm-hmm. So if they thought, okay, we recognize somehow, maybe they didn't fully understand it scientifically, we understand somehow the sun plays into our crops, the rain plays into our crops, we get that. We recognize that there's fertility. Some people have children, some don't. They would put their hopes in those concepts, and they would create a statue for them. Mm-hmm. And so they, like you're saying, like that became a part of their worship. And God says, I don't want a statue. And basically for two reasons. One is I don't want you to worship a statue because I want a relationship. I'm a living God. I want a relationship. But two, I don't want to be on a mantle. I don't want to be one of many. I want you to get rid of all of them, recognizing I'm your hope. And I think nowadays we don't create physical statues, but we still worship false gods. We put false hopes in things. And I think, again, it's just the challenge of it. And Michael, you said the fact that it says it so many times repetitively. I almost wonder how much of that is God wanting it that many times. Again, this isn't great theology what I'm about to say, but like versus Moses, who has had to lead this group
just
of
disgruntled.
People, disgruntled, where like he just keeps catching himself.
Can you
just
imagine
going,
how tired he's got to be at this point?
Stop worshiping other gods. Stop disobeying. You guys get that way as a parent, where you're just like,
gosh, yes.
Listen, I love you, little human being, but I need you to stop that behavior.
Yeah, I think about the golden calf moment, how frustrating that would have been. Just he's up there worshiping, seeking God on their behalf, and he comes down.
And they're worshiping this golden calf, and he crushes it up, puts it into powder, makes him drink it. He is so bitter in that moment. It's like
he's done.
Yeah, he's done. Like you do wonder, like, did God tell him to do that? You're like, no, that was
probably
all
not.
him. He's like,
That's just good old fashioned rage, man. There's even an earlier passage in Deuteronomy specifically where he hits on saying like, you know how insulting it is to God to make an idol out of something that literally he created, and then to worship that as a replacement. And I think that's where you catch all these layers of it. It's so disrespectful, and at this point, it could just be rage, upset, anger. But Moses is like, we're not doing this anymore. Like we have to move on. God has something better that is in his plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you will never worship that idol
again. I'll make sure of that.
All right, so let's transition to chapter 17. Let's look at the first verse. He says, you shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep in which is a blemish, any defect, whatever, for that is an abomination to the Lord your God. So there's a couple of layers to this. One is, again, we're seeing this idea of what pure worship looks like. So if you go back to chapter 16 and you have the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths, a part of each one of those was a concept of first fruits. It's the idea that the first portion is the faith portion. Right. To give to God first before you have everything else come in that would come in. You're saying, God, I believe you're going to provide. So if I give you the firstborn animal, which he commanded, I'm believing there'll be a second, third, and fourth. If I give you the first fruits of our crops, before I bring in all the crops, I'm believing you're going to bless the harvest. We've looked at in Deuteronomy the concept of the tithe, of giving God 10%, because it's faith. It's saying, God, I believe with 90%, you can do more with that than I can with 100%. In this, it's the same concept. There could be a tendency that they could look at their animals and go, well, that one has a blemish. That one has a bad leg. That has less value. I can't sell it. I'll give that to God, and then I'll keep what is valuable. And Moses, once again, I believe, clearly inspired by the Holy Spirit, is saying, no, what God deserves and God demands is one and the same. and he wants a sacrifice of something that is an act of worship. I don't want to give God nothing. This past week, I was in my devotions, and I'm going through Genesis, and I'm reading the story of when Sarah passes away. I think it's Sarah. It could be Isaac. I apologize. I'm doing this kind of off the top of my head. But when one of them died, the husband goes and wants to buy land so that he can create basically a family tomb. And he was so respected in the community. They were like, no, you can have it. And he's like, no, I really want to buy it. And they're like, no, like, seriously, you can have it. And he's like, listen, basically, I love my wife and my family so much. I don't want to bury them in something that costs me nothing. Right. I'm gonna pay. And they're like, okay. And so he pays. And then I remember the story of David. David, when he sinned at the end of his ministry as king, when he sinned and God tells him, go to this specific spot and make a sacrifice and I'll forgive you. And he goes there, and this guy sees the king coming. He's kind of terrified. But the king says, I just want to buy land so I can do an altar. The guy goes, just take it. And David says this line that I love. He says, I will not offer to the Lord that which costs me nothing. So, and I think, again, this is the heart of it is in worship. Worship should cost you something. Worship should be an expression and in faith and in sacrifice. And I know both of you are worshipers. So will you just take a moment, each of you, and just speak to that of what worship means to you, of what does that practically look like? I can say a term like it should cost you something, but like, what does that mean to you to live a life that says to God, I really do want to bless you?
Yeah. I think there are so many days that I come into, whether it's just my regular routine of worship or it's a purpose service that I get to be a part of, where I am surrendering constantly things that I don't want to surrender, maybe, or I have a resistance to wanting to surrender, or it's just a matter of things that haven't been changed in my heart, And so I'm coming into worship with the eager expectation every single time of God, I'm dealing with this, I'm frustrated with this, I'm annoyed by this, or whatever, the consequence or emotion is.
I was going to ask you to go a little bit more, again, you can be vague, but when you say something like you don't want to surrender to God, what does that look like? Because I think sometimes people might think maybe that pastors kind of float above problems. But what does that look like? And like, practically in your life where you go, you know what, God, I'm wrestling with this, and I don't want to give this up, or I don't want to surrender this. Can you speak in general terms? I'm not trying to put you on the spot to embarrass you, but you get what I'm saying.
Fine.
Hey, what's the worst thing you've ever done?
Well, I think even in times of, let's just take leadership in ministry as an example. So we get some pushback on certain things that we're doing, whether it is somebody disagrees with an approach that we're taking in ministry, or somebody disagrees with how I handled a situation. I could easily respond in that moment with my emotions, what I feel, what I want, and most often it's hard not to respond in those moments. But even today, I was dealing with a situation where I have to come before God and before others and humble myself in a way that says, could I be wrong in this moment? Could I surrender this? And is it necessary to surrender this? Or do I have the right heart? And so I think even in those moments in worship, I'm coming before God and I'm surrendering that and trusting that He's going to lead me in that, even though it's not my personal preference to always do so.
So in honor of God and in honor of the position He's placed you in, you make a difficult choice because you know it honors God, advances the kingdom, loves people well, and yet, again, we're not saying this to lift pastors up, but yet you're the one who suffers, right? You're the one who has to feel that pain and that tension. Michael, I know you feel the same way at times. Do you want to speak to that for a moment?
Well, you know what? This is actually a passage that I look to a lot when talking about musicianship and the excellence in the way that we worship. Of like, I've had moments like I can specifically think about like playing guitar where I'm just like, it's like 11 o'clock at night. And I'm really tired, and my kids are crazy all day, and this is the shot. This is my moment where I have to learn the guitar part for Sunday morning. I'm like, okay, here we go. And you can sometimes excuse things in your brain and be like, nobody cares. Like, there's like such a small percentage of people in the room who really care about, like, is that reverb just a little too, a little too muddy? That's gonna. But in those moments, I think about something like this and just have to remind myself that God is worthy of my absolute best, no matter what. And I, I talk about that a lot with like young worship leaders of just like. That those little details. A lot of times people will be like, what are like 5 things I can do to make worship better? And my answer is always like, boy, would I not know. Because the real answer is a billion really little things and hyper attention to detail. And all of them are so mundane and so boring. But at some point you have to ask yourself, is God worthy of it? Is God worthy of taking the time to do this? And I do that from a musician standpoint, but it's also an emotional standpoint. If I'm rolling in and I'm like, I'm not here, like I'm not feeling this, I'm not excited to be worshiping right now, but to say, is God still worthy of my worship right now? even if I don't feel like that, even if it's frustrating, even if I'm hanging on to something, even if
Mhm.
whatever the case might be. And the answer just always has to be yes. As hard as it is and as difficult as it is, that's where that's what it looks like to not give him the blemished sheep that's already about to die, that has a broken leg. I don't want to offer him up that. I want to give him what I have. I want to give him my very best. That's even where my philosophy of even leading worship has been, I don't have the strongest voice in the world, and I'm not the best guitarist in the world, but man, I can be the most passionate. I can give everything that I possibly have and trust that the Holy Spirit's going to make up for that deficit. That's what my best looks like. And I guess that would be my encouragement to anybody thinking about worship in this way. Of what does your best look like? If you're not giving that, you need to reevaluate because he's worthy of it.
All right, so I have two responses to that, things that were like stirred in my mind and heart. One is Michael is without a doubt my favorite worship leader in the world. So I know you always say, like, I'm not the best guitar and whatever, and I'm like, you know what? But here's the reason I say that. I can logically know you're not the best vocalist in the world and guitar player. I get that. What I love is because I do see the person behind the scenes, and so when that person leads me in worship, I know how authentic it is. And so for me, there might be other worship leaders that are just as authentic, but I just don't know them personally.
Sure.
When you get up there, and I think that is the element of it, is I know the authenticity of worship, and it's like, and I know this is what crazy as it sounds, the imperfections of your life lead me to worship more because I see you connecting to God on stage, and I love that. The second thing is, I think as a culture, you were talking about, like, it's so much easier to do these things. We are a culture of instant gratification. So in many ways, we have reduced worship to when I feel like it, I'll do it, which is so dishonoring to God.
Right.
And so that can be from church attendance to actual participation, where it's like, well, you know what? I don't feel like doing that right now. And I think that's God, you can have this broken sheep.
Right.
But when we say, you know what, I don't feel like it, but yet in faith I'm going to do it, that's the true gift of worship.
Yeah,
to God.
I could talk about that all day too. Just as someone who a big part of my job is just trying to create a meaningful worship experience for people where they can encounter God. And if they don't encounter God, then, like, okay, how can we eliminate more hurdles? That's this whole conversation. But one of the most frustrating parts of that job is knowing that when people come in with that consumeristic mentality, I think I made this analogy before to you at some point, where it's almost like if you've seen that show, The Voice, where they're all turned around and they hear a voice and they like it, so they hit the button on the chair and they're like, oh, that's great. And they stand up in the chair. That's how it feels like sometimes as a worship leader. We're like, I know you hate this song. I understand that people are still facing the other way, and I'm sitting there, I'm like, how do I make you want to worship the Lord right now? Like, what do I need to do? And then you'll see the same person, and I promise I'm leading worship. I'm not just like looking out judging people, but you'll see the same person. Then all of a sudden you play the hit, and they boom, hands up, they're in, and it's just like, oh man, what if that was our default posture? Because that to me feels like the same exact problem.
Yeah, that
our default posture should be, my best right now is worshiping you, even if I don't like that singer, even if I hate this song, even if I want more hymns, even if I hate hymns. At some point, worship has to be about our very best.
Yeah. I mean, I've shared my testimony, but the time in college where I committed that from this day going forward, anytime there's worship, I'm going to engage it, has made all the difference in my life because of all the times I didn't feel like worshiping and all the times I didn't feel qualified. I was struggling, and yet I got outside of my comfort zone, worshiped God in the way He met me there. And that's the generosity of it. All these things that God commands is the promise that He'll meet you there. And so it's in obedience. Okay, so now we're going to transition, and it's a harsh transition. We're about to talk about a topic that honestly is not easy to talk about. All right, so I'm going to read verses 2-5, and then we're going to kind of break it down. He says, if there is found among you within any of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, a man or a woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God and transgressing His covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun, or the moon, or any of the host of heaven, which I have forbidden, and it is told you, and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently. And if it is true and certain that such an abomination has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has done this evil thing, and you shall stone that man or woman to death with stones. So I'm going to pause there. We'll go to verse 6 in a moment. So we need to understand a few things, because this is shocking when you read it, and specifically in modern day language and culture. This is just simply is shocking. It's shocking in every generation.
Right.
But what God says, so let's give some little bit of context. Everyone that's going to be a part of this community is choosing to be a part of the community. As God has established it, this is different than every other nation, because this is a theocracy. It is one governed by God, that they have made a decision through responding to the covenant. So every male would have been circumcised. Then the children that were born on the 8th day, they'd be circumcised. All the women were under the authority of father or husband. So as a community, they said, God, this is what we're agreeing to. So they willfully stepped into this relationship, but God then says, going forward, if anyone worships another God and is leading others basically to do the same, and it's been told to you, research it, make sure it certainly has happened, and then if it has happened, take this person out and stone them to death. It's shocking because you're talking about capital punishment, and we look at it, and it's so anti our culture. Now, we still are a culture of capital punishment, though I would say that is definitely lessening as the years go by, but we have different forms in our country, typically reserved for the worst offenses. So in our country, I could be wrong on this, but I think mainly it has to be murder and or a crime committed while a murder is being done. I think there are some federal crimes, like if you kill a police officer and different things. But I think also treason is one, which is kind of shocking. But as a nation, we've said if you commit treason, that is a crime payable by death, right? But in this context, God says, this is what I want you to do. So anyways, the reason why I say all that is when you look at this, I think it can seem shocking, but I think we have to take a step back and recognize a couple things. One is God is just, and this is actually justice.
Right.
You know, we want the grace side of it. We love the grace side of it. But what God is explaining is the spiritual is more important than even the physical.
Right.
The physical life is important, but what that person does to lead a nation spiritually away from God, the spiritual has eternal consequence. The physical has a temporary consequence. Right. And so God is trying to establish in this nation, guys, this is how serious this is, that this person who worships false God could lead this other group away, who could lead generations away. They'll never know God, and they will be separated from God for eternity. I heard another pastor and theologians, many have said this, is this scripture itself isn't what's shocking. It's that God ever gives grace. Right. It's not that God demands death. It's that God gives grace, because that is true justice. But as you think about this, I mean, how do you process difficult passages like this where you see capital punishment being commanded?
For me, the main thought that I had when I read that, first of all, is, wow, okay, that's really intense. We're talking about stoning somebody. I can't imagine what that would be like. I've never seen something like that. One can only imagine, right? Really intense. And that thought of, wow, this is really intense, led me to what I would, the reconciliation of like, that means that the alternative is really intense. That means that
that's a good way to,
you know what I mean? Like if this is this crazy in my cultural brain, so barbaric, and so it's like, wow, that means this is very serious. And that means the alternative is dangerous, and not just that person, probably to many. And so for God to say, this is how serious I take this, because I know God being love, that everything is an act of justice, an act of love. I know that even in this, what to me culturally would feel barbaric, is God still caring for his people enough to say, this will not be okay if I don't take a drastic measure here.
Right, yeah. I'd go back to even what Michael was saying, and defining who God is, looking at his character and how he responds in most situations, or in all situations, and understanding that men are so impressionable, and the moment that their hearts start getting pulled away, even as you were saying, that weakness kicks in and they could be pulled away. The heart or the thought of generations could be pulled away is devastating. You know what I mean? That we're leading away people from worshiping God and experiencing the blessing of that relationship. Yeah. And so that's kind of just what I have to remind myself, is that God views idolatry in this way because it's that devastating to the nation as a whole, but also to the individuals themselves.
Right, and that's where I have to remind myself, they're literally about to, hopefully come out of exile. So it's like, the consequences are real. This isn't theory. Like, we're talking about, there are real life and death consequences, eternal and otherwise, for what is about to happen. And that's just the best way in my head I've thought. It still feels really intense. I'm not going to lie. Sometimes the Bible's intense, but I just have to have enough trust that God, okay, there is a plan here, and I know that it's better than whatever I would have.
Yeah, we've all said these things, but and I think when we take a step back and realize the holiness of God, the fact that he's commanding these things, the fact that he's giving second and third and fourth chances and 100 chances, he's so full of grace that when we take a step back, we have to realize, no, this is how holy God is, that idolatry really does deserve death. And he doesn't give it to us all the time. Otherwise, all of us would be dead. And so he gives grace over and over. Okay, let's go on. Verse 6, he says, just still kind of handling this topic, but he wants to understand the weight of it. He says, on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. So he's saying that this isn't something to do carelessly and casually. There's a seriousness to it. But the only reason why I separated that verse and highlighted it is just for a teaching moment. One of the scriptures that I hear most often, I think misquoted, and I'm not saying this to sound smart or to maybe embarrass someone else. I actually think I want to address it theologically. Is in Matthew 18. Here's the verse. For wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. Like we've all heard that, right?
Yeah.
And people quote it like on a Sunday. There's 2 or 3
Right.
of us. I've had people go, hey, can I just ask you, what if it's just me? Like, is God not in my midst?
Right.
Or 2 or 3. And I was like, okay, this passage in Matthew is actually referencing that,
Yeah.
where if you go back in Matthew 18, he's talking about if a brother sins against you. Someone sins against you, you go to them, you try to handle it. If they don't respond, bring a couple of friends, a couple of witnesses. If they still don't respond, take them before the church. If they still don't respond, treat them like an outsider, basically, have nothing to do with them, but still show them grace, but just treat them like one that's not of faith. But then God says to them, he says, again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by the Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I'm among them. What God is saying is, like, if they bind or loose something, if they're saying, okay, this person, we're casting them out, God's literally saying, I'm going to honor that.
Yeah.
I'm going to allow that person to experience the consequence of not submitting to spiritual authority. So God is with the 1. God is with 2. This scripture is talking about eyewitnesses.
Yep.
So just a little quick teaching
super
moment.
Good,
Don't I sound super smart when I do stuff like that? That's how I feel when I say that. I'm like, I'm not trying to act that way. Verse 7, the hand of the witnesses shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. I couldn't help but miss, or not, like when I saw this truth, to think about, he says it's the hand of the person. I witnessed it. I reported it. I have to be the first to throw the stone. And you see this transition in the time of Jesus where, so this person would have to kill that person first. They would take the first stone to assault them. I think about the woman caught in the act of adultery that is about to fulfill the law, to pick up the stone, and Jesus says to them, okay, let me tell you who's going to be the first to throw the stone. Instead of being the first one to witness their sin, let's let the person who has never sinned be the first one now.
Yeah.
Jesus starts to really dramatically change our perspective of things. God needed us to see the weight of sin, the consequence of sin, and Jesus is like, I need you now to understand the weight of grace.
Wow.
And so, like, I love that in John 8 where he says, you be the first, and all of them, they start thinking through, they're like, well, we're all sinners. They all drop the stones. And Jesus says to her, he says, where are your accusers? They're all gone. No witnesses against you, no one that wants to throw a stone against you. And Jesus could have been the one to pick up the stone and throw it, and he instead releases. I just think that's a powerful moment.
Yeah, very good.
All right, so let's go to verse 8 as we kind of transition to a new thought. It says, if any case arises requiring decision between one kind of homicide or another, one kind of legal right and another, or one kind of assault and another, any case within your towns that is too difficult for you, then you shall arise and go up to the place that the Lord your God will choose. And you shall come to the Levitical priests and to the judges who is in the office in those days, and you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you the decision. So in each community, they would have had their own elders in their system. But he says, if there's ever a situation that you can't resolve, I want you to take it outside of your community and go. We know in context it probably would have been Jerusalem, where the Levitical priests were administering this spiritual central hub. Take the issue there and allow them to talk about it. So again, this is where God is giving them the civic law and structure. So he says, go there, take it to them, submit it to them, to the spiritual authority. And then he goes on in verses 10 through 13, and he adds weight to it. Now, again, this is a lot of weight, because we just talked about if someone is in idolatry, put them to death.
Right.
But now he's going to give them another reason to put someone to death. He says, so you take your problem before the judge, the priest, they give you their ruling, you need to honor it. Then you shall do according to what they declare to you from that place that the Lord will choose, and you shall be careful to do according to all that they direct you. According to the instructions that they give you, and according to the decision that they pronounce to you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the verdict that they declare to you, either to the right or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously by not obeying the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that man shall die. You shall purge the evil from Israel. and all the people shall hear and fear and not act presumptuously again. So there's a lot of weight here.
Right.
This is God establishing the authority structure, and the highest authority in this culture at this time is the priest, the high priest, the Levitical priest. And he says, go to them, but whatever they decide, you need to submit to them. Now, submission to authority is something that I highly value, but I also think is something, let's just be honest for a moment, we get the most pushback in the concept of when we have to talk about it's one of our values for membership. People are like, what does submission mean? You know, because in our culture, let's just be honest, we don't celebrate submitting.
No, not at all.
We celebrate individuality, individual rights and powers. So what do you think? Why is submission so important to God?
Everything revolves around submission.
Yeah.
In a relationship with God, it starts first and foremost there. And I think establishing it first and foremost there can help, us develop that in other areas of our lives. But it's such a valuable tool because it not only gives us perspectives that we wouldn't normally have, especially in this perspective of Levitical priests, seeing things from the perspective of the laws and what would govern the people ultimately. So they're seeing it from that perspective, and to go against that would then ultimately be going against the authority of God, but also against the authority that God had established within that community.
All right, speak more to that. I think the point that I love, and I know that this is what I even have in my own notes, they see something you don't see. How often that's true for us. We're handling situations, and a person can get upset, and the decision we're making or whatever, and we're like, you don't see what we see. Sometimes we have more information, sometimes we just have a different perspective. But even in our own lives, we are not perfectly self-aware, right?
Absolutely.
So speak to that just for a moment of like the value of trusting that someone else might have a different perspective than I do.
Yeah, I think I see it most in the context of connect groups. That's one of the things that people celebrate the most, is that I've been living it as an individual my entire life, but the moment that I get into a group, some people start to talk from their perspectives and it's completely different than mine. Yeah. And it starts to give them a better perspective or a view on how God operates in people's lives, but also on maybe how they've always handled something in their life and that it is maybe inappropriate or not the correct way to do it. And so I think being willing to submit to others, but also submit to new perspectives is such a valuable tool, clearly if it's led by God and it's influenced by God, but being self-aware sometimes happens in the context of relationships, and hopefully you're gaining self-awareness, or being open to gaining self-awareness in every situation.
Michael, you had, before you came on staff, so in your ministry training, you were part of a community that really did stress spiritual authority. Obviously there can be some negatives to that, but for overall it was a positive. And I know for me, being your boss in that sense, it's something I've always respected, is there really has been an honor culture, a submission culture. But so I'm gonna say something that sounds like a negative. You weren't raised with the personality that you submitted to authority.
Fair.
Let me word it another way. You were rebellious, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was a transition for you.
Yeah, big time.
To where now it's funny because like you tell me the stories of your childhood and you're a great storyteller, so they seem funny, but it honestly sounds like you're describing someone different. Like I'm totally. Like, I don't know that person. Here's a person I know. Talk about the value of submission, what that transition looked like, what had to happen in your mind and heart, and why now you see the value of it.
Yeah, submission terrified me growing up. Like, I hated it. The idea of giving someone your agency is not fun. And to this day, honestly, as passionate as I am about, like, submission's good, it's still tough. Like, it's still really hard sometimes. Growing up, I wanted so bad to be my own person, and anything that stood in the way of that, it was like, well, wreck it. Like, get out of here. And I was just such an ornery kid, and I went to this program called Master's Commission, heavy emphasis on authority. So every second year in the program is in charge of the first years in the program. So that means you have 19-year-olds in charge of 18-year-olds. Wild.
What could go wrong with that?
Crazy. And what was so intense is I remember I was so angry at this second year, and I felt like he was the worship leader, and I got there, and I thought I was so cool. I played I played a bunch of instruments. I'm like, yeah, man, wherever you need me. It's like, all right, well, I need a bassist, so I want you to play bass. And I was like, all right, well, I sing too. And I also you don't have to put me on bass. It's like the nerd instrument is how I felt at the time. Like, I'd like to do something else. And he goes, no, I'm going to leave you on bass because I think you're arrogant. And who told me that? And I was like, awesome. Love that. This guy I don't know, who in my arrogant, 17, 18-year-old brain, I'm like, bro, I'm a better musician than you anyways. Who cares? I'm so angry and I'm so frustrated. And I remember that was just for the rest of that year, me and this guy are just going head to head.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at one
man.
point, this is so foolish. If there's any young people listening, I'm not glorifying this. I was just dumb. He told me to do something, and I was just like, he said, dude, you have to know how to submit to authority. And I was just like, the Bible also says, don't submit to a fool. And I'm like, so.
Oh,
I
man.
remember telling him that. So I got called into a meeting after I said that. I thought I was real slick. I thought I was being real clever and biblical. And the director of the program calls me into a meeting, and he just opened up his Bible, and he was really kind. And he just said, like, he talked about David and Saul and how David submitted to Saul in spite of the fact that Saul was trying to take his life. And he closed his Bible, and he's like, has so-and-so like chucked a spear at your head today? He's like, no. He's like, then shut up. He's like, you need to learn how to submit to authority in your life. And it was legitimately a breakthrough moment where I wept. I called my dad and I apologized. I called my worship leader growing up and apologized. Like peers, like people who I know, in hindsight, I know that I was so disrespectful. And I know that God placed them in positions of authority in my life, and I didn't handle it well, and I didn't submit to them. I didn't submit to God as a result of that. And so this really fearful moment of, man, I don't want to give my agency up. Like, I want to be my own person. I don't want you to tell me what to do. I'm also like, it's kind of pretentious to talk about sometimes, but a type 8 in the Enneagram, so I love power and control. Like, I'm like, so I want to be in control of stuff. It makes me feel safe. It makes me feel unsafe to not have power and control. It makes me feel very unsafe to give that up to somebody. But what I just had to realize that the more dangerous position is to not be submitting because I'm not submitting to God. Mm-hmm. If God designed me to submit to the authority that he put in my life, and I'm not doing that, that's scarier than giving my agency up for a moment and allowing someone to say, hey, you know what, this might not be the way I would do it. I don't want to play bass. You're annoying, but I love you and I'm going to submit to you. As frustrating as those moments can be, that is the safer way to live because that's the way that we were designed to live. And that was the pivot moment where it clicked of like, this is how God designed me, whether I like it or not.
He not only designed you, but he blesses you in that when you submit. It's like I said in the beginning of our Bible study, all of these things are rooted in faith. I give first to God, believing he'll bless second, right? Yeah. Same thing in submission. I'm submitting not even to the person. That's why when you have scriptures like Romans 13 that say submit to all authority, we can do that because we know above all authority is God. Absolutely. We can submit in faith, believing God really can work it out. The same conversation I referenced earlier, I was out with my son Titus, and he asked about why pastors fail and different things. And he started asking me about just my own leadership and the structure I set up. And I'm an Enneagram 8 also. I have that same drive. And one of the things, I was just talking with Mackie about this last week, Enneagram 8s, their biggest fear is that someone will try to control them, which is a somewhat kind of redemptive way of saying like they want to be in charge, right? But there is a truth to that. Submission feels like, well, I'm giving someone power to control, but when you can cross over in faith to say, exactly, I'm giving God power to control. It's different. And when I was talking to Titus about it, I said, he was asking about my leadership style, and I said, I recognized very early that if I created a culture where I was a power unto myself, I would become very evil very quickly. And because I know my nature, I know my lack of character, I need that. So I said I created a culture of transparency where I share what I'm going through, not because I want to, but because I want everyone around me, like the other pastors and the elders. So that even as elders, I'll share like this is the good, this is the bad. I do the same thing with the pastors. And so there's the value in it. So the things that we promote, submission is not something that we're promoting for people that submit to us. We're promoting submission for ourselves equally to say like we need to submit. And even within our culture, I think you and I had a conversation about this yesterday, the day before, that we have created a weird hierarchy in our environment that is mutual submission, and other people will look at it and think like, that's odd. Yeah. It might not have been you. It might have been Mackie I talked to because you looked at me like,
it was
us.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I was curious about where we going. All right. It was me.
You ever see that where someone's eyes go like that? I was like, maybe it wasn't you. But I mean, just in our culture, because we wanted to teach mutual submission. Right. So there are people that, you could be an elder and submit to someone else. You can be a pastor and submit to this person. You can be a director and submit to that person. But because we just see the value in it.
Super good.
Okay, so let's go on to verses 14 and 15. And so he goes on and he says, now he's going to talk about that concept of kings. He says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You shall not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So it's kind of an odd passage because, at times Moses just kind of hops from topic to topic. You're like,
and another thing.
Yeah, right.
One more thing.
So let's just quickly, I'll just kind of give a background. This was God's initial desire was for them not to have a king. God's initial desire, they would go into the promised land. In that, they would develop healthy community within that, structures that we've already looked at. You're going to set up judges. You're going to have the elders. You're going to have the priests. Spiritually, within your own culture, there are things to protect you. But from outside forces, God would be the protector, and he would raise up what he would call judges. And so this would be like Deborah. This would be like Gideon. Samson was supposed to be, though he's a lesson in failure. But God, he would raise up these judges to, at times, stir up the army, go and fight. And then, honestly, they would kind of go back to their lives. That was God's heart. The judges became even known somewhat prophetic. So Samuel was technically a judge, but we also know Samuel as a prophet. But at the end of Samuel's time, the people started to cry out for a king. God knew that would happen in this. But it wasn't God's desire. So even when you read it in Samuel, it's very sad. It's a very, very sad passage of scripture where Samuel is feeling rejected. He has led with honor. I mean, he has never compromised. He's really one of the few characters in scripture that we don't see a situation where he sinned and dishonored God. And he goes to God and he's feeling that rejection. And this is the sad part. God goes, Samuel, let's just be clear. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me.
Right.
But God goes, but go ahead and give them a king. But when God says, okay, so you're going to desire this, you're going to desire a king, here's some parameters. One, I'm going to choose a king. You're not going to do an election. You're not going to pick a person. I'm going to choose the king. And he says, make sure it's one from among you. So you're not taking an outside or a foreigner. You want someone that has the same values, the same ultimate goal. And then he just says like three kind of random things. They can't get a lot of horses. So you read it and you go, okay, so God hates horses. Okay. Like specifically from Egypt, he hates the Egyptian horses. But in that, it's so much deeper than that. It's God is saying that. And even as I was like studying it and you start to see it, you go like, oh yeah, it's such a deeper issue. If a king were to accumulate a lot of horses, the horses revolved around military might.
Correct.
The king would start to put his hope in his own power, in the power of his military. If he started to accumulate wives, and again, that's an odd thing. There's a lot of questions about that. But for a king, the vast majority of wives that they had were actually military alliances. It would be another nation. We'll give you a daughter, and she'll become your wife, one of your wives, and now we have an alliance with you. That the king would start to put his hope in those alliances. And then the last part about accumulating silver and gold, he would put his hope in the money. But the second layer of it is the same thing would happen to the people. The people would see the king with the large army and put their hope in the king. They would see the king with all the alliances. They would put their hope in the king. They would see the king with all the money, and they would put their hope in the king. And what God is always trying to say, what he was trying to model for them is, I want you to put your hope in me. And so I don't want you to even have a king. I want you to put your hope in me. If you're going to have a king, make sure that king always puts his hope in me. And it goes back to the same concept we looked at earlier of idolatry, of we put our hope in things. So here's what I want to ask you guys. So when we look at a story like this, and we see the potential for failure, and we even saw many of the kings failed in this area. Some degree, even Solomon specifically, where Solomon accumulated these three things, right? Wives and horses and wealth, and allowed his heart to drift from God. In our lives as Christians, what are some things that we can do, some practical things that we can do to not allow our hearts to drift from God? Solomon had every reason, the kings had every reason to see God's faithfulness, and their hearts drifted. Same thing can happen to us. Do you have anything in your own personal life that you say, these are just a couple habits that I have just to make sure that I don't drift from God?
Yeah, I really don't. I don't want this to be a cop-out answer, but here's the reality. Following the things that God asked us to follow, I have always found puts me in this place because God often asks me to do things that are conventionally unwise. So submission, conventionally unwise. Again, for someone who I like control, it makes me feel safe.
Right.
Giving control to somebody, very unsafe. Now I don't have control. Tithing, I want money. It helps me do things. You know what I mean? Like, I want my money.
Good.
Yeah. Money, good. It helps me do things, makes me feel safe. Something happens, I have money to help me. All of these things that God asks us to do are conventionally, again, if you were to just remove any concept of faith or a deity or God, and you say survival of the fittest, so many things that God asks us are anti-survival of the fittest. Kindness, generosity, being nice to sick people, all anti-survival of the fittest. It's all inherently dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
But if I say, again, what's more dangerous is not doing the things that God
that's
asked
so
me to
good,
do.
man.
And when you
Yeah.
really believe that God is who he says he is, and if I really believe I'm made in his image, I have to submit to the things he asked me to do. And in that, I find such a deep level of safety. And a safety in my life that when I feel hurt and when something bad happens, I know where to go to because I know that I already have that. I'm already where I need to be to talk to God. I'm already in this space where I feel full of the Holy Spirit, and I feel I feel like I have that access point when I pray, and because I'm submitting to God, and because I'm listening when he prompts me, it makes me feel safe that I can hear him and all these things. So for me, because I don't want to be a cop and answer, but if you do the things that God asks you to do, it comes with such a level of safety that I can't describe.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, one of the simple things, just to kind of piggyback off of that, for me is this idea of welcoming feedback. Like,
Mhm.
there's so many
good.
times that I don't want to welcome feedback. The last thing that I want is somebody's thought about me.
Hmm.
Clearly, I'm seeking authority or somebody who I have influence in my life, a mentor or a spouse, that type of thing. So welcoming feedback gives me perspectives, even as we were talking about earlier, on my life that I wouldn't normally have.
Right.
So if I'm
Yeah.
acting like a jerk, and somebody recognizes it and speaks to me in a healthy way and says, you're acting this way, that has been such a great, not only freedom for me, which is weird because it feels like it should be the opposite, but also a direction for me that, that's an awareness. I need to go now change that behavior. So, we're really good about the staff in doing that. I've set up people in my life who are very, candid with me to speak to me and say, hey, this behavior sucks right now. You know what I
Right.
mean? But also even in my relationship with my wife, we have that relationship where
Yeah.
if she recognizes something similar to your situation,
Right.
where they'll give it to you. And there's nothing else attached to it, but just healthy feedback about how, I can change those behaviors in my life.
Yeah, I think you referenced that we have this culture as a staff. I think you have to be purposed about it to invite true dialogue. I really, unless you have a person that for whatever reason just naturally is okay with confrontation, which is very few. I mean, even you and I were Enneagram 8s. People would say that about us, but even then, that doesn't mean I want all confrontation.
Right. Still,
you know?
yeah.
But to invite people in to give me your opinion. Give me your opinion. So like for us as a staff, if you're on our staff, you're supposed to like once a week have a conversation with someone where you say, hey, how's your heart doing? Right? Like, and you get that person, you build that relationship where you can go, you know what? I'm finding myself being really impatient with my spouse. I'm finding myself being impatient with my kids. Or that person can say to you like, what's going on? Like your body language is whack.
Yeah.
And I do that sometimes to our staff. I try. I don't word it that way, but like, but you just go, hey, like, you doing okay? Because like, you don't look like it.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that to be in judgment, but I also want to acknowledge, like, let's talk about whatever that issue is. And I think for the kings, he was saying like they had to be purposed about it. And so even the last couple of verses that we'll look at, he gives them something really practical to do. He says, and when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priest. It's kind of a fascinating idea. He's like, he wants him to have like the king's copy, like his own little handbook of the law of what he's supposed to do and not do. And I'm imagining it's more than just this one law that he's supposed to write down and keep. Maybe it's just the one law, but I think it's more the concept of the laws of God. Many even suspect, if you guys know the story of Josiah, which I absolutely love, I'll actually teach his story in our next series that we're going to do on Kings. But Josiah was raised in a culture that wasn't following the law of God, and one of his leaders finds a copy of the law of God, starts to read it, and has this panic moment where he's like, uh-oh, we're not doing this. So he brings it to the king, goes, King, you have to read this. King goes, okay. So he starts reading it in the presence of the king. And it says like Josiah starts to tear his clothes, which was a sign of mourning and fear in their part. And he's like, we're not doing this. But they would have been doing it if they had a copy and they were constantly reading, if it had value to them. He says, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. And I love this. God says, take the law, keep looking at it, keep focusing at it, keep running at it, And here's God's promise. His kingdom would remain long because God would bless them.
Right.
God's blessing to all of this. So in our lives, all these things we looked at, the end where we began, it all requires faith. But when we walk in obedience, God blesses it. And then we discover, as you said, that is the best way to live.
Yep, absolutely.
The world kind of paints this image. It could be better. It's not. Following God is the best way to live.
Yeah,
Amen.
super good.
Thanks, guys, for joining us. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us in our Bible study. Well, thank you for joining us today. We pray that this was a blessing to your life. We pray that you not only understand the passages better, but you understand how it applies to your life and some practical steps that you can do so that this information can be more than that. It can be life-changing for you. And here's what we always ask. If this is a blessing to you, do us a favor. Share it with family and friends. You can do so personally by sending them a link. You can also share it on social media. And we know that God is going to use this to be a blessing to other people's lives. So in advance, I just want to say thank you.